record to the cloud, and there we go. So hello, welcome everybody. We are here with Brent Cooper, who is I guess I'd call him metamodern intellectual, and also behind a think tank called the Abs-Tract Organization. Now, Brent, smart guy, and seems to have this interesting ability to piss off lots of people in lots of different subcultures of the internet. It's quite remarkable, actually. So Brent, I kind of admire that in you. And we were just talking just now, the kind of premise of this conversation. We're interested to have a bit of a pollination of ideas, but then also to engage in some critique of one another as well. I think Brent has got some points that he would like to raise against Daniel and me in the context of the conversation we've had on ontological design. And I think Daniel and I have some thoughts on metamodernism as well. So with that said, welcome, Brent. And just introduce yourself a bit if you'd like, and tell us about the work you do and what your thoughts are on us.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, it's a nice introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to practice introducing myself, which is, always comes out a little bit different each time. It's in motion, but I'm trained as a political sociologist, so I'm always framing things through a kind of comparison and dialectic between politics and society, right? And so that's part of why I'm, challenging other people through that sort of lens. And also international relations is my undergraduate degree. So kind of geopolitics also, colors a lot of my priorities and kind of framing of things. And so from that, being disillusioned with a lot of where theory was at, where activism was at, I got drawn into kind of metamodern discourses and also wanted to map the terrain of that and try to contribute to that field and kind of normatively lead it in certain directions. And also more recently kind of map out what hypermodernism is too, because you can't really talk about metamodernism, I feel, without understanding its dark side or shadow, or, juxtaposing it with a whole other discourse that otherwise doesn't actually overlap much. And so, we, a lot of us overlap in interesting ways, and I promote a type of sort of convergence of our efforts rather than just a kind of free-for-all and an emergence of whatever. I call my project the Abs-Tract Organization because the concept of abstraction is something that actually helps flesh out and distill what exactly thinking is, on one hand, what is cognitive abstraction, and what is actually abstraction in the world, like social abstractions between us, like language and religion and just forms like capitalism, like what is it? And the abstraction of money, and finance and, techno capital, if you want. And so these things, and I'm still developing the theory, but it goes deep into different literatures and different fields. So abstraction is this kind of through line. So I use it as a tool to kind of try to distill concepts and try to intervene into discourses and, try to pierce the veil, try to break through to a paradigm shift, right? I think it's mediated by abstraction, how we think about the world. And money is this theme that keeps coming back. It's part of my kind of ongoing intellectual diet, and I think something we have to talk about for how we change the social conditions. And I don't mean cryptocurrency. I mean like the abstraction of money itself and how the state produces it. So there's all that. I guess that's kind of my intro. And then did you want me to kind of give some bullet points of what my critique is?
Let's go for it, man. Let's launch straight into it.
Yeah. So, I'm in the so-called intellectual deep web list with you guys. And I've said on the list many times, I think it skews right-wing quite a bit. There's a lot of centrist or conservative or reactionary kind of attitudes. And, I pointed out similar things in Game B. And, regardless of the extent that that's true, there's a kind of blockage towards sociological thinking. People don't want to or are incapable of talking about things like socialism or Marxism just on an intellectual level, right? And of course, Alexander Bard can do that. He's very literate in all these subjects. At the same time, I try to hold his feet to the fire and say, why don't you support the left coalition of Bernie Sanders and whatnot? So I think intellectually, all of us are so, in a sense, smart and informed, but there's a lot of hand waving away kind of some of these social complexities, and also just employing each other's kind of concepts uncritically. So my sort of case in point with your guys' video is to say, like, Jordan Hall's idea of the blue church and red religion. In my critique, I point out, like, this came from a Trump subreddit, and you can problematize the original source of that, the guy who was writing that, and then to import that language wholesale kind of does a disservice to the complexity in other sociological theories that aren't saying, blue church, red religion, right? And so I have that kind of quite big critique. Like, we can go deep into that, but then also I just say, okay, if you're going to import this language, like, well, where's the green temple? Like, where's a third pillar alternative? Because I do see kind of three main political currents in the world, kind of neoliberal centrist, right-wing authoritarian, and left kind of cosmopolitan socialist, right? And so to pretend that there's just two sides, even though there is just two parties in America, kind of, downsamples too far what's actually happening. And just broadly speaking, in these circles, not just you guys, but like the emerge space that I'm in, integral spaces, there's a lot of just people actually using their intellect, using their philosophical literacy to ignore and to deny kind of the leftist alternative perspective. And, my own bias aside or whatever, like, it's actually, sociology is not in a biased way, but it's kind of default kind of socialist, leftist, not in any monolithic way, right? But it's like that because it studies society and historical kind of social movements and progress and whatnot. So for me, I mean, if we're all to be on the same team, like, these things have to circle back and converge through a narrative process and just through kind of like material determinism, if you will. The internet, of course, is enabling that, while it's also enabling post-truth, right? And so you guys have many intelligent things to say about those things. But then where the rubber hits the road in these so-called sense-making spaces, I feel there's a lot of double standards applied, a lot of like hypocrisy. So, I get kicked out of a space for being aggressive or whatever. But then some of the people, like, say, Jordan Peterson or James Lindsay, for example, who are extremely aggressive and extremely opinionated and extremely misinformed in some cases, they're given a pass. They're apologized for. They're followed, and people get on the bandwagon because they have a sort of momentum. So I guess the thrust of my critique and my question to you guys is, like, how can you uncritically work with and communicate with, say, Jordan Hall when he uncritically embraces, like, Jordan Peterson, And so it creates, because the critiques have been around for the last few years. It's not just me advancing these critiques. I'm kind of asking, how is everybody so uncritical while also being critical of things like social justice or whatever may be in the crosshairs of the news cycle? And, this is part of what I try to challenge on the Stoa. So I've done 2 Stoa talks now, Who's Sensing the Sense Makers, and then one recently on anti-intellectualism. And that was kind of the conceptual capstone to the thrust of my critiques, to say that, hey, intellectuals can be anti-intellectual, right? If you're Steven Pinker and you have tons of awards and adulation, it doesn't mean you're above reproach, and if we take someone like Noam Chomsky, he's a intellectual and activist hero of mine and of a lot of people. He's, I can have a different view of him on a given issue, but broadly speaking, he's a role model. And so I'm trying to follow him. I'm trying to seek agreement with him, right? And build consensus with his body of work, which is easy to do if you just follow it sort of, just faithfully. But you can also problematize these and go, well, maybe Zizek's a little sloppy here or whatever, maybe Chomsky's a little missing the point here or just being a broken record. But broadly speaking, I'm with them. I'm with the Bernie movement, and I'm proud of that. And so intellectually, the kind of avoidance of that realm of activity of political engagement, I think, has been a big loss for our community. And too much of the discourse has been directed in the last 4 years through the intellectual dark web sort of lens or sort of prioritization. And so it's a good thing that you guys can kind of invite critique, and I can invite it back, and we can have a proper dialogue that kind of goes beyond everything that's been happening and includes all the prefigurative work everybody's been doing, all the games and whatnot.
Yeah, for sure, man. I think I'm glad that you brought this up, and it's cool that we get to dig into it. So to start, if we think about this idea of blue church, I think certainly when I use that term, essentially what I think it relates to is like a structural dynamic rather than a specific political orientation, which is where the blue and the red kind of, for me, aren't the most significant thing in the actual term. So blue church it's this, through the kind of lens of Marshall McLuhan's work, it's the mass media society. So literacy leading into television, radio, advertising, the nation state and the post-nation state, the ability through media technologies to create a kind of universal identity that holds actually vast swathes of people together, and typically doing this by telling them they live in a meritocratic, individualistic society where scientific progress is the means for advancement, where then the red religion comes in as the description for the new digital swarm phenomenon that is kind of partly a reaction against the blue church, but also just something set off by the new technological possibilities. It's a bit of a wild west space, and the blue and red designations kind of get connected to it in the sense that in the context of the 2016 election and the fact that it was the online swarms, if you will, that drew people towards Trump and indeed towards, say, Brexit in my country, much more than, say, the traditional institutional and media apparatus, which was connected to this, you might say, the neoliberal establishment. You could even go that far as to say that. And so when I use the term blue church, it's not to delineate a left-right political orientation so much as just to speak of the media environment that we are now leaving.
I think there's also something, I agree with your critique, Brent, and I agree with everything that you said, Owen. I would just add that blue and red are obviously loaded terms, but there's an interesting aspect about using the term, and I'm being very creative with my theory here, and perhaps I should be a little bit more, when we use these terms and import them wholesale, there's space to question them as well. But church is a good word because it refers to this indeed neoliberal 20th century apparatus composed of academia, media, the expert class. So essentially that the translation of power, and like Hollywood and those who are responsible for saying what is true. And so the use of the term blue church refers to the previous paradigm of these people who were responsible for saying what is true. And then once the network paradigm, once technology rolls into the internet age, that old church is a little bit dissolved and something else comes in. Now, it may have happened that they looked blue and red in 2016. Maybe they won't in 2020 or 2024. I think that's kind of beyond the point. I mean, at least what's interesting for me is really how where it leads in terms of the actual acceleration of the flows of information and what that does in truth and sense making. And then the second point that you brought up, which I think is a good one, and here's a thought. Let me know what you think. I would consider myself a design theorist, meaning that what ontological design is for me, more than establishing sort of a coherent body of work through which to analyze an ever-flowing world, it tries to be a little bit of an operative engine for design. Something it's not really a lot of things, but it can be applied to many things. So as opposed to being kind of a map of the world, it's a way to map the world, if you know what I mean. This is more processual in that sense. And so in that sense, not only am I perfectly comfortable with snagging a concept from Jordan Hall or from Jordan Peterson, or even further from Nick Land and Dugin, people with clear fascist tendencies in some point. But even in other examples, in other people from other edges of the spectrum, what I'm comfortable with doing, I think it's interesting, is that there's a certain, I think today we can do a sort of a collage and take a little bit of what is interesting from the dissolving landscape of meaning making, where borders are so mobile. So really, like, do I really have to agree with everything and understand everything this guy says in order to make sense of what, to use him in my theory? Well, maybe I should, but I will not, because I don't have enough time. And also because ontological design, the way that I approach it, is more like this little egg that moves, this processual. That's why your work on abstraction is so cool, because it has this operative tint to it, and thereby is less, so the ontological design is less philosophy than design theory, and hopefully applied design theory, which again can be used to advance any political purpose. If we look at it from the border point of view, you know, it could help bring in revolutionary aims, or the other end of the spectrum, right? So that's what I would say.
Are you a fan of Benjamin Bratton? And like I've written about him, so I try to, through my work, you know, provide a window to that, because I think he's kind of, in a way, like the arch ontological designer, you know. And I don't want to speak for him, but I think he's very leftist at heart, but he's not too politically engaged, you know, and he's in Russia, you know, whatever. So, you know, that's fine. But like, I try to direct people to his work, but I also would say, like, you know, don't cherry pick from his work, because he is kind of presenting like a paradigm, and there's enough, like, you know, kind of meat there that you can lose yourself in it and just work within his parameters. And, you know, it's ever evolving. All right. So the Strelka Institute comes after the Stack, and then he's got the new normal, and then the terraforming is the kind of current phase. And it's just, I think it's really groundbreaking stuff. And then I tried to, you know, I worked on a smart cities book throughout 2019. It was published in March or something, or May. And then I published an article about it. It's kind of my review and kind of my, you know, communication of convergence theory. And basically, because it was a smart cities book, we tried to develop something that was, you know, related at least to what Bratton was doing, and related to a lot of other things. Like, so I cited some of the kind of metamodern thought, and also, you know, Michel Bowen's with the commons and those kinds of theories. But then I also kind of clash with Bowen's just around talking about the intellectual dark web kind of issues and status, and, you know, I want to get through that, you know, and not just like agree to disagree forever, but actually get somewhere. And so I'm saying all this to get back to a kind of fundamental point, which is like, I can appreciate your guys's ontological design theory, and Bratton's for whatever, and smart city, design. But then if we're not also advocating for, massive investment in education and infrastructure and, housing and income itself, giving people a UBI, none of these theories will become practical or have any utility beyond our own little individual projects and our own, kind of operationalizing these things for ourselves, like getting off on getting better understanding. There's a kind of thrill to this cutting edge stuff, but none of it means anything if we can't, solve the climate change kind of a collective action problem within 10 years, right? And so that's why, like, I'm very kind of sort of old school mainstream in a sense, that I want like a robust United Nations. I don't want superpowers duking it out in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. I want every state, and I want, from the local to the global level, to have every citizen cared for, and so this is just basic democratic socialism 101. And I'm inviting intellectuals to get on board with that, because I think anyone who's doing this kind of work, it necessarily dovetails with those kinds of logistics, right? So Jim Rutt and I argued about the Green New Deal. I'm like, and he was a Bernie supporter. And I'm saying basically, well, it can be funded, it has to happen. And Jim Rutt's saying, no, it's not fiscally responsible. Where's the money going to come from? And so that issue literally falls apart because we can't build a consensus around the economics of it. Mm-hmm. And that process is blocked because we have disagreements over the kind of culture war aspect of it, right? And I'm saying we should actually all kind of step up to prioritize overcoming those epistemic conflicts. And then, see if we can find some baselines on agreeing, like, hey, healthcare for everybody, education for everybody. And then that's going to facilitate your ontological design.
Let me throw something to you and see what you think about it. I do not disagree with anything that you said, except for perhaps one thing, that is that roots to power. So ontological design originally appeared in my life and started to theorize around it in the context of achieving effects through design. So in architecture school and in the beginning of my design career, I was confronted oftentimes with, and this is pure design speak, confronted many times with a lot of projects that purported to install systems, to create sort of frameworks for understanding, but then they were all plagued by certain ineffectivity, right? And there was perhaps a great theoretical body of work behind them, especially the 60s and 70s, and mostly 60s and 70s French school of critical theory and how that purports to design. They were very connected, and there was always a lot of very beautiful theory behind that, like New Babylon by that Dutch guy, and which is a concept that we hear about in Metamodernism in terms of reinventing struggle as play and all those things. But from my perspective, they all remained relatively not only ineffective, but they were always recuperated by the market, always, and that always annoyed me. You look at Centre Pompidou in France, which is this building that was inspired by previous visions of an architectural playground where people's full potential could be fulfilled. And then I think it's a train station that just looks like kind of weird. It doesn't do what it purports, what it says it does. My building will free people. No, it won't.
Yeah.
No, it won't.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, how do things achieve power and get stuff done? And this is a question that is transversal to the political spectrum in this sense, right? Stalin answered this question, Hitler answered this question, and today we have to answer this question as well in our terms. And the answer that I came to was ontological design in terms of the feedback loop. So I'm sure you're aware of that. And that philosophical insight, together with the changing technological conditions of our day, with technology, with internet, and with that, I believe that they can offer a route to power that we can even see playing out in our real lives, right? not to say that education and healthcare aren't really important things, which they are, and I would advocate them for everybody, obviously. But hasn't the internet also represented a tremendous dissolving force, a tremendous route to power, a tremendous way to put in place power relations in our societies for whoever wields them? That's the whole point, right? You don't invent the hammer and then get to say, don't murder people with it. That's going to happen, but that's kind of a property of the technology. And so what I would throw back to you and see what you think about it is like that though the political and perhaps the consensual mainstream democratic socialist route to power or to development is definitely a valid one, it is not the one of the vanguard, because it kind of, if you think in terms of like levels of abstraction or levels of how it happens first, I think it tends to happen first somewhere else, and then it seeps down into the level of political action. So this vanguard here can be technological, it can be a little bit more artistic, whatever it is. I mean, for example, and just to finish off, there was this, I think it was the founder of, it was not TikTok, or maybe someone who worked for TikTok in America. They had a book of Deleuzian theory on their bookshelf. And I'm like, this is something very notable, right? What are they doing here? And those subtle ways of affecting power, framing discourse, are where I feel there's something to it. It's what Zizek says, right? If your boss is an asshole, then at least you know he's an asshole. But if he's your friend, you don't even have the means to articulate your own unfreedom. And so I believe that design can represent a way, and technology can represent ways to affect power in ways that are perhaps more volatile and more effective than the one that you just mentioned. I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah. There's a couple threads there. So I'm just going to say what kind of comes to mind. One is that, I definitely don't consider like kind of the IDW, either form or Rebel Wisdom or whatever, as kind of curating this vanguard or Game B. I think that's kind of a mistake. But there's a lot to be said about our different folk theories of power and politics in determining our kind of expectations, right? So, years ago, I had a friend that I worked with, and, we were just like, whatever, laborers in this kind of lab environment. And he was a friend because we both had a background in critical theory, but for whatever reasons, he was a Trump supporter in the 2016 election, and I was a Bernie supporter. And he saw it in terms of his kind of preferred narrative, like, oh, Trump's the Joker, and he's gonna, burn it all down, and this is what we need. And I'm like, okay, I get that, but that's insane. Like, it's just, you're in it for the joyride, not for the actual grounded historical political struggle of what needs to happen, right? So we're coming at the narrative with our pre-contrived notions and expectations that, oh, he's the Joker, and there's actual, anti-hero, and there's some logic to that inversion, and we need to watch it play out and just appreciate where people are at. Okay, but it was actually an incoherent debate between the two of us, because he kept, pulling all these wild cards out to make his arguments, and I'm trying to just make a grounded, basic argument, like, look at Bernie's track record, look at his career, and the point I'm getting to is you and others in Jordan Hall are very astutely aware of the problems of corporate media, yet there was like no commentary on the very clear fact of how corporate media was suppressing the Bernie campaign, right? And there was a Vice documentary that came out in, I think, February, that kind of retrospectively just chronicled and proved all this. It was called Bernie Blackout. And so it's like, hello, I'm like shouting at the top of my lungs, like, the blue church is fucking suppressing the Bernie movement, which is an authentic emergence. Yep. And now we have a Biden, like, textbook blue church kind of presidency, right? So this is what we've graduated into. And I feel like we've all failed as a sense-making collective to avert these types of kind of fallout from our decision trees. And I think we can do better. That's fundamentally my injunction all the time. Like, I wish I could have convinced my friend 4 years ago that he was on the wrong side of history. I wish I could have, been more influential in game B and whatnot. But I feel like the capacity is there to grok how we're being manipulated and what we should do with that insight.
I wholly agree with everything you said, but I would say, like, completely, there was a media blockout. The blue church is Biden, and he suppressed this other alternative movement in Bernie, who has great policies if you look at them individually. But you also mentioned something, which was the narrative and the political narrative of it all. And my only response to that is not so much that I do not feel inclined to participate in that debate in the terms that it is formulated. My inclination has always been to step outside of those terms, of the terms within which that debate happens, and try to invent some sort of Archimedean point, reinvent the rules of the game, especially in the age of the internet and technology, right? And through that, achieve effectiveness, which is, theorists during the World War II, right now with Trump, they always complain, and rightly so, that we didn't achieve anything. Why? Because the tools for effectivity have been overlooked, I guess. And again, I come back to the examples of, for example, the fact that the iPhone has changed the world so radically. I give this example. So in architecture, there was a lot of discourse on urbanism throughout the second half of the 20th century about how urbanism can be, and you know this, right? You've studied this, and what I would argue is that the impact of the iPhone and of Google Maps on urbanism has vastly outsized the impact of the theorizing efforts that came before that. So my point is, what's going wrong? We're looking at the wrong thing. Let's put the weight where it hits.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree on this idea of an Archimedean point, and we're looking for that leverage, and that's what attracts us to meta theories that I don't like this phrase, but that transcend and include everything that came before, right? And yeah, I mean, I've just felt with my trajectory that it just so happens that my kind of meta theories actually dovetail with the political emergence that I would say, like, is the legacy of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movements, is the legacy of the WTO protests, is the legacy of the Occupy movement, is the legacy of Black Lives Matter. Like, all these things actually converge and really need to be incorporated. But I'm trying to agree with you that, like, part of my struggle too has been trying to find this Archimedean point that actually goes over and above all the kind of contextual theory below it that actually has not anticipated the meta crisis of the 21st century. So there's breadcrumbs throughout the 20th century that is like the speculative of the meta crisis that some people did see it coming, and I believe that many people today see it coming and know what's happening and are the effective leaders that need our support. And so, although Jordan Hall kind of endorses Jordan Peterson, I note in my critiques that he also kind of endorsed AOC the next year, kind of, is authoring kind of a supportive perspective of those things. And I mean, I think those two are like diametrically opposed, but I give them credit for being on AOC's side because she catches a lot of flack from misogynists, from white supremacists, from skeptics generally. And I think coming back to this Archimedean point, and it being money, the abstraction of money in modern monetary theory, this is actually pretty close to the Bernie and AOC kind of core of those movements. Like, they are key actors of the movements, right? AOC is a key author on the Green New Deal. And Stephanie Kelton, a big MMT proponent, was an advisor to Bernie, and Andres Bernal, who's a thinker and activist on MMT, is an advisor to and friend to AOC. So all these things are actually connected in very constructive, optimistic ways if we could just actually raise awareness around it and build a consensus around it. Because, yeah.
I think where I find myself thinking a lot at the moment is just, I don't know if this democratic socialist or Green New Deal vision is the one to solve the problems. I don't know if it's radical enough. I think it is still in many ways a blue church mass society attempt at solving the problems. It's get the elected officials into the big political bureaucracies and then let them solve it. It's still fundamentally working with those rules of the game. It's just that hope that if we get the right people into the top of the institutions, then we'll sort it out. Or similarly, this vision that if we could just increase education, the implicit assumption being that the education system as we have it now with schools and universities is is desirable, and increasingly I don't think it is. I think school is a mass production factory for neoliberal consumer products for employers. I think university is a totally corrupt establishment that charges people far more money than they need to pay to get a decent education. And I think that, so talking about, say, this vanguard that Daniel mentioned, the internet gives us the possibility to basically declare war, for example, on the universities and find out a much better way of doing it. In fact, I think that's exactly what we're doing right now. We're actually getting engaged citizens who research what they're interested in and are interested in making a real impact on what they're interested in, just during the conversation and making them completely public and completely open. And I think there is a business model to discover in the next 10 years of how do you have guys like ourselves and our extended network having small digital classrooms and perhaps charging some fee just so we can pay the bills. While also spreading knowledge, information, access to networks, access to actual movements that are doing things. For example, the European men's movement that I'm quite involved in. We're doing men's work kind of across Europe at the moment and hopefully going to expand it. That is where I'm much more interested in placing my political thought and agency than in supporting like the Green New Deal or the democratic socialism.
I get it. I got two things to say. One is that these are the types of critiques I like, where you're not saying the Green New Deal is wrong. You're saying it doesn't go far enough. And I agree, right? And I don't want people to think like, oh, Brent advocates a Green New Deal. He thinks that's going to solve everything. I advocate the Green New Deal as a kind of minimum viable, platform. But then I love the critiques that go beyond, right? And so through the Strelka program, they actually have a presentation on a military Green New Deal. And that's basically kind of going beyond the Green New Deal. I mean, I think, and Bratton has this phrase from the website, greener New Deals. And it's basically like just saying like it needs to be, times 10, an order of magnitude more intense and scaled. But the other thing is so I get we all have limited time and engagement, and you're saying you're, engaged with men's movements and sort of apolitical. And so I guess in a sense that's fine, but my kind of complaint, it's less a criticism and more of a complaint, is that there's a sort of brain drain where some of the smartest people are drawn away from politics because they see no personal incentive, they see no positive outcomes, when it's precisely the logic of kind of tipping points and rallying cries and bandwagon, not in a fallacy sense, but like, converging around, Sunrise Movement or Extinction Rebellion, precisely to, at the end of the day, vote in a collective way that puts, say, Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders in power. And again, not that that's going to solve everything in itself, but it's going to make a difference in a lot of people's lives. It's going to point us in the right direction. And it's going to make it easier for people like us to keep doing the kind of cutting edge work where we're looking for that Archimedean point and say, okay, let's now transition from a Green New Deal to UBI, to full education, full employment, revamping the universities. And to put it kind of like tongue in cheek, right? Kind of like fully automated luxury communism, right? Kind of Star Trek utopianism that without, teleporters and warp drives, like we can still have the kind of fulfillment of enlightenment ideals and kind of world peace, without it just being some pipe dream. It's like actually practical within our lifetime. So yeah, so I want to encourage people to not just like, don't tune out too far, because we're missing these historical opportunities, right? Like Noam Chomsky said that Bernie's candidacy itself was historic. His success was historic. And then even though he lost twice in a row, Noam Chomsky says it was a success. We foregrounded all these ideas. It's now mainstream to talk about Medicare for all. It has a large majority of support. And yet these things are all still held back. So I have a hard time kind of celebrating the victory prematurely, because it's all just still in the talk phase. And if we can get through this threshold together, like, okay, pass a Green New Deal, pass Medicare for all, then that box is ticked for me. I don't have to harangue and critique everybody so hard, because we've made a major step forward. And then we can keep, as I say, keep doing our work, keep looking for those Archimedean points to go beyond politics, go beyond technology over the next 10 years, have a real quote unquote paradigm shift.
It's interesting.
Yeah. I think this search for the paradigm shift is the key thing. I think this is the attractor point that most of us are aiming after. What I think now, I come back to what my anarchist friends in the UK say, where they're like, we hate the Labour Party, because what does the Labour Party do? It sucks all of everybody's left-wing radical energy away up into this thing, where then they just have this sense that if we can get the Labour Party in, we're good. And my fear, I know I'm more or less rehashing the point I previously made, but it's like we only have so much energy and attention. Too much focus on something like a Green New Deal that isn't radical enough just gives a false sense of security. And so where I'm much more interested in is really in the radical underground, where we can do totally new stuff with technologies, totally new social operating systems, totally new ways of relating to each other as people that are not filtered through the alienated, individualized, hierarchical bureaucracies of blue church neoliberal capitalism.
Yeah,
essentially.
Yeah,
if I might just add something, one of the things that makes me reticent to fully engage with projects of this type is the fact that I believe that they do not formulate the coming problems of the next decade well enough. In other words, techno-capitalism is advancing and accelerating really rapidly. We know that the market really recuperates any sort of creativity and kind of deflates any quote unquote revolutionary potential that exists, really integrates that into the economy, castrates it. And the acceleration of information, of technology that is the protagonist in my view. And what many of these political movements try to do, and here's a bold statement, is to try to solve 21st century problems with 20th century methods. And so that's why I'm always trying to look into working with the grain of techno-capital. So for example, ontological design is closely tied to this idea, to the idea that in the next 10 to 20 years, the inequality is going to be also at the level of people becoming perfect consumers, micro-targeted to exhaustion, their ability to formulate their own and freedom wrenched from them. And that to me sounds like, there's many problems. I'm not going to compare problems. Healthcare is an important thing. Education is an important thing. But hell, is even our ability to conceptualize of our problems being also taken away from us? What sort of, isn't there grounds for revolutionary action there? And thirdly, are the methods and the technologies for achieving that power, for achieving those revolutionary goals, don't they exist in things that are outside of the traditional mechanisms of politics as they have been formulated in the 20th century? Do they sit outside of activism as we understand it today? Do they sit outside of, these movements that we've been describing? My answer would be yes. My answer would be something like, for better or for worse, oftentimes for worse, but if we look at, I'm not saying this gleefully, but pragmatically, the internet, look at what Airbnb did to the rental market. Look at what Amazon did to bookstores. This was like 10, 20 years happening. Nobody could have predicted. It is as if we had already lost and been defeated and need to reinvent the ways that we even tackle these problems, because at this higher level, we all agree that these fucking problems are invading us from the near future. That's the plan, by the way. And
it's overdetermined. That's a word that I use a lot to explain these things, because you need that label in order to start dissecting the multi-causal aspect of it. That it's like you can even know that it's coming and there's nothing you can do to avoid it. So we need that deep leverage to under determine these issues.
Exactly. And that's part of why I'm attracted to, a lot of what Owen does with his thinking is to bring this pathic intuition to it. We call it the mad wisdom. Why? Because my tendency is to feel that at this threshold, not only of activity, of critique, but also of cognition, where we're at the edges of our abstraction. I don't know if you agree with this. Maybe you can tell me that. But at the edges of our abstraction, there's a space for intuition. There's a space for alternative modes of cognition. Here's a revolutionary thing for you. The paranoid critical method by Rem Koolhaas, who, by the way, is an architect who used to build a lot of neoliberal buildings and buildings for these, $100 million type buildings. But he also came up with this paranoid critical method, which is this weird way to shuffle the grammar of how concepts come about. It's inherited by Salvador Dali, and then juxtaposing them together to create new meanings. I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, fuck yeah, this feels so, there's a certain pragmatism to how small and handy it is, and deployed in the right place and boom, something happens. I think that technology of power produces larger returns on the power on the investment that you do than on my opinion and in my decision, the involvement with politics per se. That's just me.
Yeah, I think all that makes sense. I'm finding agreement with you guys. One thing that popped into my head is just a blind spot in the kind of agency that goes with this thinking. The focus on kind of techno capital and cybernetics and whatnot is this is an obvious thing, but in part kind of the supply chains, right? So the computers we're using, have whatever, cobalt that was mined by slaves or whatever the thing is, right? Everything's kind of tainted. And so the point you make about capture, regulatory capture and creative capture by the market is key, but our agency is being captured too, to dissuade us from the political engagement, which at the end of the day, I'm saying is for others. It's for those invisible other across the world who are just slaving away in a factory. But so there's that. And then I also wanted to add, I totally agree with, let's say on the political left, even through a kind of Green New Deal, there was a lack of discourse about systems change, about paradigm shift. And I got very little traction trying to push this left metamodern synthesis, because most leftist spaces are dwelling or utilizing that kind of 20th century language, labor movements and unions and, all these things. So I agree with that, I kind of lament that inadequacy of the left to care about paradigm shift or systems change or high theory. And I'm still struggling to advance that, like I had a good kind of synergy with Michael Brooks, right? Who's a very active, out in front kind of leftist organizer and commentator. And he passed away this summer, and kind of a large part of the momentum with that dies with him. And it's just so tragic, because we worked so hard to advance a critique of the intellectual dark web and to build a kind of left consensus around that particular issue. But then the consensus never went outside the left itself. It didn't really get through to the IDW figures and their interlocutors. So I'm just saying that to kind of agree with your guys' point, but also invite you back, like use your knowledge to try to contribute to leftist movements, because they're not a lost cause, even though they're trapped in this kind of language from even the 19th century. Like, I hate the term, the means of production. Like, that is just so sort of archaic compared to how supply chains and production actually works in a highly, highly abstract way today. And in a sense, Marx did anticipate a lot of this, but not all of it, and we're really in this kind of paradigm shift moment where indeed a lot of the language is redundant or defunct, that we need to reinvent it, but in ways that does not cancel out the efforts of say environmentalists or labor organizers or feminists and whatnot, because they all had a point, they all had a thrust, and they were all part of a broader program in the first place, right? Martin Luther King's quest of economic justice beyond racial justice. So if we had a left consensus or coalition rather, that was even bigger than the Bernie coalition that happened, that included Gamby, that included the Alexander Bards and whatnot, and these opportunities are going to happen again. We're gonna get those opportunities. We have to seize them, rather than just like go off and let's have a podcast talking about Rene Girard for 30 episodes or whatever it is. Like, as interesting as these things are, we can't all reside in the graduate mindset, which is just fun and therapeutic and challenging, but that it doesn't translate to any actual transformation in the planetary consciousness itself, which, to take that new age language and ground it goes back to, okay, universal healthcare for 8 billion people, universal K-16 education for 8 billion people. If we can dream that big, we actually do have the logistical capacity to do it. But it requires us to like make real breakthroughs in our sense-making sessions and what we're doing right now, trying to have a real deep conversation.
So let me throw a quick fire question to you. If you could choose between achieving consensus perhaps on these spaces that we were talking about, or having one shot at changing one thing and it really worked and it really changed without consensus, but like a little headshot, which one would you rather have?
That's a good kind of dilemma, let's say. Maybe I could give kind of two answers, like a kind of Schrodinger's cat kind of thing. Like,
how metamodern of you.
Yeah. Both and. In one scenario, I'd say that one kind of thing I would wish for would be a UBI. But even with that, I say like, well, just UBI is not enough. Like, people have to have some sort of community to spend it in, community to exist in and thrive with. Like, just cash in a dystopian hellscape is not the solution, right? So UBI is that kind of Archimedean point, but it needs a bit, there's some conditions attached with that. And then to answer the other question, Owen's frozen. Is he?
He's probably gonna come back.
Okay.
But please continue.
Okay, yeah. To try to address the other alternative, if I could build consensus, I think let's say I'm leaning in that direction because it's a harder thing to do, and it actually means everybody's minds are kind of collectively there he is.
My internet went down there.
If we can do that, it means everybody is kind of synchronized, and there's kind of, I'm doing a consensus workshop on Wednesday. You guys are welcome to join, but like I make a clear point in my consensus article, it's not groupthink, right? Consensus building and groupthink are like the opposite, because groupthink is bad. And we don't just want, like, it's not, hey, this is my theory, everybody come on board and support it, because that could lead to groupthink or capture or whatnot. So yeah, I tried to answer that question in both directions. I think it was a good question.
Mm-hmm. Because yeah, go ahead.
I'm mindful that I need to wrap this up in a sec, so I'm thinking I'll invite you both for just some kind of final comments and thoughts. I mean, I think I'm just going to mention one thing in relation to the thing Brent said just before this last thing about supporting or connecting to the left. And I have two thoughts on this. The first is that I think we need to figure out exactly what these new operation systems are, if you will, before we just go and try and get mass political support for them. The thing that the contemporary left struggles with, I think, is lack of a paradigm shift vision. What we're working on now is trying to theorize the paradigm shift and then hopefully technologize the paradigm shift, but we haven't cracked it yet. And to go and try and get mass movements behind it when it's still just a pretty idea in the sky, I think that's the wrong way to apply energy. I think to kind of use what Daniel said, is to go for the headshot first and then be like, okay, guys, look, we figured out how to get the headshot. Now come and check it out. The second thought is that, again, this idea of connecting to the left, this is precisely why I've got engaged in men's work. Men's work is, so the second thought about men's work, this is how I think I can actually reach subjects who are struggling in a way that I will be able to understand their struggle and hopefully have a meaningful impact on their lives. And so that's where I get that kind of engagement, if you will, rather than going through a political party. It's more community oriented, if you will. So those would be my closing thoughts. I've been a bit interrupted by the internet, but
So on that, I understand where Cooper's coming from when it comes to the building of the consensus and getting people together on like-minded challenges, as opposed to the fragmentation. However, perhaps fragmentation and atomization of opinions, attitudes, and worldviews is an effect of the internet. And in that sense, in the same way that, Sloterdijk speaks about the egosphere, and he speaks that, as modern capitalism and then with technology moves forward, we become increasingly atomized in our own spaces, in our own lives. It's like individualism times 10. Might it not be that is causing some difficulties in achieving consensus? We know the internet sometimes does that. I'm thinking out loud. We also know that the internet is really good to create some sort of convergences, but they tend to be populistic and very limbic. And if you can design a slot machine, you can design those consensuses as well. And and hey, maybe I'm not I prefer, when it comes to community, I live in Portugal, and community for me means my grandma's village and the community in there and my family, and so it has that sense for me, sort of a co-creative community where people help each other. But then on the other hand, I guess that my way to tackle what I believe to be the same struggles that we're all tackling, because they are, is through tackling the ontological aspect of it. And ontological is a heavy word, but I use it deliberately because our very being in the world is so radically altered by technology that it doesn't do away with the need to actually achieve political change and advancing certain causes, which makes it all just complex. So while we're changing, the world's changing, the borders in the world are changing. So it's really complex. And so my way to sort of grab something as my sort of sword, my tool, is really this operative engine of design theory that is ontological design. And hopefully there's an applicability to that that can enable, I don't know, a solid change, a headshot. Because I've seen time and time again, and this is a pet peeve of mine, how the market and the corporate world recuperate everything from, having worked at a large company and seeing all these awareness events here and there and everywhere. And I just felt that this is not it. This is not where it should be going. This is the spectacle. Guy Debord is one of my top thinkers. And his theory on the society of the spectacle, speaking about the autonomous march of the non-living and the fetishization of images, just creates this place for capture, like you say, but even for like recuperation that puts us in a tough spot, out of which, maybe we've already been defeated, and that's our starting point. And that's the starting point that I assume for myself, and thus the ontological gravity of speaking about ontological design and these deeper Heideggerian concepts, because otherwise, I don't know. That is at least my approach and my thought.
Yeah, I hear you both and appreciate those insights. And I think, we're so similar in many of those regards. And, a thought that pops into my head is, even after I finish finish writing what I think is a great article, I'm immediately like disillusioned with it. I burst my own bubble, I auto critique it. I recognize it's not going to make any impact. And then it's like this, so what factor? Like, where is the outcome of what I'm doing, what any of us are doing? And I think that's good, to be self-critical and keep trying to iterate further and find leverage. So I wanted to make that point. And also I wanted to say there's a book called Ontopolitics in the Anthropocene. Daniel, if you've heard of that. So that concept might be a bridge for us to have a further conversation on the ontological and the political, right? How they overlap and intersect. And that's from 2018. I can send it to you. We can like dive in and, explore that concept together. And then related to that, I wanted to say, to your point, Daniel, about everything being captured, part of my impression, not to undermine Owen's work and contributions to communities, is to say also that is a kind of example of something being captured and a market being created for it, right? So the fact that there are men who need men's work or whatever it may be is a consequence of a failing education system or a failing healthcare system to provide the extensive, comprehensive, care, politics of care to avert those situations in the first place, right? So a lot of the kind of Jordan Peterson, bootstrap solutions, like clean your room and, be a man, kind of is on the wrong end of the stick of the problem, if that is a working metaphor. So I say that not to discourage what you're doing and finding meaning and connecting with other people and men and we need to do both is all I'm saying. And so I do a lot online, I could do a lot more too on the local community level to feel engaged and to feel that I'm giving back. But fundamentally, I urge us all to try to do both, because the political, for all its, inadequacies, is still a lever to advance some of these basic systemic changes. If it's the right policy, it works. And I want sort of dramatically rapid changeover and change. And I think that's what you guys want too, in this idea of a headshot, right? But just to make a counterpoint, my dad often invokes the example of how policy ultimately over like 30 years made smoking like less popular and pushed it out of the public, right? So banning it in restaurants and stuff. And his point, and putting warning labels on packages, like his point was that change is incremental. It takes years and decades of these little tweaks and, you know, whatnot. But the irony from a meta point of view is like scientists knew smoking was carcinogenic, you know, 70 fucking years ago. And, you know, it's climate change too. And so there is a kind of systemic conspiracy that normalizes in the first place the falsehood, right? And marketizes and promotes the falsehood. And then we need this incremental change to undo it. And so there's a valid point there. We should work towards that incremental change in the right direction. But also we're trying to jam here and imagine like very short-term 10-year window, like global systems change and planetary consciousness. So we gotta do both. That's my closing point.
Speaking of that, if I can squeeze in just a final question, like you use the term Adam Kadmon in your older work.
Yeah.
What do you understand by that? Because
I
love that term.
I appreciate the question. I mean, you probably know more about it than I do, but I gravitated towards the term because I was packing my film narrative with all this mysticism, right? And all these illusions. And so like one of the main characters is David Vitruvius. So he's like part the Vitruvian man, you know, that Vitruvius was the architect that kind of came up with the proportions that then Da Vinci drew, right? And that became a kind of iconic symbol, you know, incorporating the golden ratio into the human form. And so I wanted something archetypal. And then, you know, Adam, the idea of Adam and Eve is like this, you know, Judeo-Christian notion of like the original human. But Adam Kadmon is like the abstraction of that. You know, it's like this cosmic metaphysical being that they're saying and like, you know, came into humanity or Homo sapiens. And so I just thought it was a cute kind of reference to incorporate into the story that I was telling, that the guru of abstraction that I was playing has this kind of normal name, but esoteric sounding. And that of course he as a person is just a person like I'm a person, but it's a conscious act to try to or it's an activity, you know, I've participated in this activity through meditation and psychedelics, but to kind of imagine a metaphysical being or archetypal human that then maps on to who we are, right? And so like the Christ is a abstraction of a possibly historical figure named Jesus, right? And so that's why I chose Adam Kadmon, like this original man searching for this Archimedean point of change. And I think you know, we have some connection over that abstraction is itself is a good conceptual kind of point, but it's also a constellation of points, right? It's not easily reducible into one simple definition.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I would add, but I'm worried that I'm aware we need to wrap it up, Owen.
Yeah. So, I mean, listen, it sounds like we've got plenty of material for another conversation, and I would love to invite you back, Brent. I think you've been a great conversation partner. I think we can all benefit from doing more of this.
Awesome. Thank you. I really enjoyed it and agree totally. And just one last point that I got highlighted here. Owen, you did say in the Stoa talk towards the end, like, you know, as a sort of advice to people, make sure you have people who will challenge you. And so you guys invited me to do that. And I think we had we proved a very productive method in that. So thank you.
Absolutely. Right, everybody. Let's kill it. See you later, guys.
Alrighty. Bye-bye, guys. Thank you for the conversation.